Hey, everybody. Before we get into the show today, Melvin and I would just like to tell you how you can support the show.
Don't forget to leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes, write a written review, and tell a friend.
You can follow us on social media. We're The Life of X on Facebook and Instagram, and at Life of X Podcast on Twitter. We're definitely the most active on Twitter, so you should join us. Follow us there. Retweet our tweets.
And head over to our support page at lifeofxpodcast.com.
There you are going to find several options to support the podcast. The first is audible.com. For those of you who don't know what audible.com is, it is the largest purveyor of audiobooks on the internet. I have personally been using it for years. Many of the books that we have used for the podcast can be found on Audible. If you go through our portal on our page, you will receive a free audiobook when you sign up for a monthly subscription, and they will also kick us a few dollars.
You can also support us by going through our portal to Amazon. If you do that, any purchases that you make, we'll get a small kickback.
We've also added a featured book page to the website. Any of you who are interested in actually purchasing the books that we've used, many of which are fantastic books, you can go through there, and that will route you through our Amazon portal to the Amazon page where you can purchase the books. And so, again, we get a few cents off each purchase. Additionally, we've set up a Patreon page, and for those of you who are unaware of what that is, it is a service wherein patrons can pledge a certain amount of money per episode. So every time Melvin and I release an episode, you would send us $1, $2, whatever you can. We would appreciate anything. We have goals set up. We have different tiers so that we can also reciprocate your generosity.
All your dollars help.
That's right. But again, we would just like to say that the most important thing that you can do is rate, review, and tell a friend. Help get our name out there. All right. Enjoy the show.
Thanks, guys.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Arif Jadala.
And I'm Melvin Barnes.
And that makes this The Life of X.
So what's been going on?
Not a whole lot, man. We have been procrastinating pretty hard today.
Today, yeah, it's already, almost 3:30.
We were supposed to start recording at like 11.
Stakes were calling.
The stakes were calling.
And we had to get our act together.
We also did have to get our act together. For those of you listening in the future, Melvin and I are on accelerated schedule to try to pump out as many of these recordings as possible before he leaves us for China.
Jolly old China. My day job.
And I actually think that this will be our first back-to-back weekend recording.
Yeah, this is kind of wild. I feel like I'm seeing too much of you.
I'm personally sick of looking at you.
Whatever, I eat your food though. It's kind of nice.
Yeah, nice for one of us. So, anyway, who's on the docket for today?
Today we have the Holy One herself, Saint, Mother Teresa.
Man, I gotta tell you, I think we talked about this before, but like, I was so sick of just reading these people and being disappointed. And Mother Teresa did not disappoint.
She did not disappoint. I also want to throw this out there. Once again, great mother. Like, not talking about Mother Teresa, but like her mom.
Yeah, another one.
Yeah.
I think that's the key. I think that's the key of being notable, is to have incredible parents, or at least one incredible parent.
Yeah, that's all it actually takes is one incredible parent.
It seems to be also helpful to have your other parent be awful.
Yeah, although I'm not going to go so far as to say that her father was awful.
No, he wasn't. I'm just thinking back to some of these other fathers that we've covered.
Definitely not Father of the Year material.
No, but we need to just, offer a apology to everyone who's ever spoken any language that is in the general Balkan region, because we are going to slaughter your mother tongue.
Yeah, we're going to do some damage today. Our specialties, Arif.
My specialty is English.
English and a little bit of
Arabic, but just a touch.
And then, obviously my specialty is in English and Chinese. So we're gonna hurt some people's feelings today.
Yeah, so we've got a couple languages that neither of us have pretty much had any exposure to.
Not gonna lie, my Albanian's a little rusty.
Mine is non-existent. Neither is my Hindi. So.
Oh yeah, I forgot about Hindi.
We're gonna hurt those people's feelings too.
Please forgive us, but we're gonna try. You know what? College effort, A for effort. whatever. We
maybe
out here.
Maybe a B for effort. So just forgive us. But yeah, so we are going to dive right in to Mother Teresa.
You want to start us off, or you want me to go in?
I'll go ahead. All right, so here comes the first mispronunciation. Mother Teresa was not born Mother Teresa. She was born Agnes Boyachu.
That's a good job. That was good.
A for effort. On August 26th, 1910, in Skopje. It was what then?
Man, at the time.
All right, so we've discerned. Melvin and I talked about this for like 15 minutes. Her family ethnically is Albanian, okay, but when she was born in 1910,
let's break it down. Let's break it down. So basically, for any of you guys who are not familiar with the region, the Balkans, it's obviously become a term, Balkanization, which we use to talk about things that have just been made crazy by tons of fractures, and it's just all over the place, right? And that's where this is, this early part of the story is taking place. So it's hard sometimes to keep straight what country is what and whatnot.
So we need to be clear too that at this time, even though it's like really hard to tell like what nation the country she was born in, whatever it was part of the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
So understand that she was born in the Ottoman Empire, if nothing else. And I don't know if Albania would be the proper, declaration of where Skopje was when she was born, but we'll just run through this real quick. In 1912, Skopje, her hometown, was annexed by the Kingdom of Serbia during the Balkan Wars, which was a collective effort from the Balkan countries to break away from the Ottoman Empire.
And this was the first Balkan Wars. I think there was more than
one,
right?
There were two, if I remember correctly. Please,
yeah.
Please direct all of your hate mail for incorrect fact stating to Melvin Barnes.
Oh, wow.
So then after World War II, it became part of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia.
No, that's World War I. After World War I, it
right.
became the Kingdom of part of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, or just Yugoslavia.
Sure. 1944 became the capital city of Democratic Macedonia, which later became the Socialist Republic of Macedonia, which was a federal state, part of the Democratic Federal Yugoslavia, which later became the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And then, in 1991, it became the capital of the Republic of Macedonia, which is what it is today.
So I think that those changes, especially those name changes, just reflect the state kind of being drawn into the Eastern Bloc.
Yeah.
So, you have the socialization. And then obviously in 1991, we have the collapse of the Soviet Union. It changes again, and you end up with the Republic of Macedonia. Now, those historians out there that are versed in this region, you can obviously, let us know if we got it correct. But, we did our best.
Pretty sure we didn't, but we tried. And so anyway, when we refer to her hometown, we're just going to go with Skopje and understand that depending on what year, it was one of those other things.
Yeah, it's good. Obviously, during this time, changes a lot, so we'll just refer to it Skopje,
yeah.
like I said.
So I got off track before I even finished. Born Agnes to her parents, Nicola, and then her mother's name is another difficult one. I'm going to go with Dranafile. The author of the book that we used for this, which we have yet to mention, is the Authorized Biography of Mother Teresa by Catherine Spink, which is fantastic. I would definitely recommend it to anyone who is interested. She has written several books on Mother Teresa, a few other figures, and also the other Catholic institutions and that sort of thing. She's also had the opportunity to go through Mother Teresa's papers and interview Mother Teresa before she died.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biography is pretty good. It's I would say it's on the positive side.
Oh, for sure. It's like a glowing.
Yeah, it's very positive, but I think she also takes some time to touch on the criticisms and maybe some of the concerns that people had about Mother Teresa.
Yeah. Agnes had 3 siblings, 2 sisters and a brother. One thing that I don't know if it was missing necessarily, but her one sister is really not talked about much at all throughout the book, like even her death or anything like that. So she had one sister, Aga is what I'm going to go with, AGA, and then Lazar was the brother. But honestly, I don't even remember seeing the name of the other sister. I know that there was another sister, or at least
potentially another sibling.
Yeah.
I mean, if there was one, she's not really discussed at any sort of length in the biography, but the other siblings do get mentioned more often.
Yeah. So, anyway, at the time when she was born in 1910, what would become the Balkan Wars were ramping up in her hometown, and her father, Nikola, was a successful merchant businessman, and he really got connected to the
Albanian
independence movement.
Yeah.
And the family was also like very religious, very conservative. They were really into, church and spirituality. And her mother, especially, we'll touch on this a little bit more. But she really was kind of like a proto Mother Teresa.
Yeah, I mean, some of the sayings that we get from Mother Teresa appear to have come from her mother.
Yeah.
Which we'll get into a little more in just a moment. But generally speaking, the family appears to have been pretty well off. I mean, her father was a successful businessman and
politically connected,
and he was also very focused about having his children receive a good education.
Yeah.
So I think part of their early years were really centered on education in a lot of ways, like language training.
Yeah, education, religious and otherwise.
Yeah. But unfortunately, her father was not long for this world.
Yeah, and quick correction, just checked. There were only the 3 children. So I don't know. I made up her third sibling.
Okay. So yeah.
So it's just one sister, one brother. But anyway, Nikola, as we mentioned, successful, involved politically with the independence movement and that sort of thing. He goes off, on some trip with a bunch of other political, they're not necessarily politicians, but they're like political figures to try to kind of spread the word and establish more
kind of just supporters, I would say.
Yeah, more supporters elsewhere, like throughout the Balkan region. And he comes back on like a cart, and like his health had completely declined. He was young, I think he was in his 40s.
Yeah.
And it's like really mysterious as to how he ends up dying.
There's some suspicion that he was poisoned, right, while he was on the trip. And I wonder, these guys, maybe they're out generating funds for this resistance movement. But, one question that I have is, who would poison this guy? Was he significant enough to be targeted for poisoning? We don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I believe he was like a councilman or something like that in Skopje, and I mean, I don't know how much weight that would have held, or if someone meant to poison someone else, or
yeah.
Or
I mean, it would have taken
was.
some decent organization to poison this guy while he was not in Skopje, when he's
on the
away
road.
in Italy, right? Was that where they were heading?
I believe so. But anyway, his death was, kind of damning for the family, and definitely would have been a lot worse if not for Drina, the future Mother Teresa's mother, because Nikola's business partner was not interested in making sure that his former business partner's family was taken care of. He pretty much, took advantage of his better understanding of the law and that sort of thing to more or less seize all the assets of the partnership and leave Nikola's family with little but their home. But this really, it didn't deter Drina. She turned super hard to religion and just dug in deeper. And like I said, they were already a religious family, and she turned to prayer a lot. She really encouraged her children to be more spiritual and really encouraged the helping of Skopje's poor.
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting about this is that, obviously this is during the time when a lot of women were expected to serve in the home, right?
Yeah.
And she wouldn't necessarily have had all those connections out in the world, but she managed to go out there and take care of her family. But at the same time, they're also serving kind of people within the community and helping to take care of those that were in need, despite the fact that their family had been placed in this tough position, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, I think there's a story in the biography about this lady in Skopje who's kind of crazy that they brought into their home in part because no one else would take care of her.
Yeah, and obviously these are things that stuck with Agnes throughout her life and throughout her service. These are more or less exactly the things that she does when she receives the call and does her work, and that has made her so famous. Agnes, was a very good student, and Spink talks about the fact that she was a talented writer and very bright, and could have easily had a career in teaching or some other field that was related to writing and that sort of thing. She was talented, and very smart. And she had also, Spink says that before deciding to become a nun, she had also expressed the desire to start a family. But she really felt called to religious service very early on in her life. I believe around 12 was like the first time she started to have these ideations. And then by 18, when she was finished with school, she had known that she wanted to become a nun.
It's also really interesting to think about the fact, like the way her family responded to her desire to become a nun. Her mother was very religious, but that didn't mean that she came out immediately and said, "This is a great idea." It seems to be the case that her mom actually kind of tried to dissuade her from this, but it wasn't because she didn't want her to become a nun. The way that it's portrayed in the biography is that her mother was sort of testing Mother Teresa's resolve and to see if she was really all in on this life, because if she was going to have a daughter go into religious service, it was going to be 100% or nothing.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine yourself at 18 being like, I'm going to give up my whole, future for any cause, not even necessarily religious service, like anything that would like drive you like that. There's a chance I like never see you again, especially in 1912. Like,
oh yeah,
it's not easy to hop on a plane and you know what I mean, and just come back home and see mom.
Man, I mean, at 18, I wasn't ready to give up PlayStation. Seriously. You know what I mean? So I can't imagine leaving my home, my family, and just going to some far off place and kind of living this sort of cloistered life. And her brother, I don't know if they talk about it at this point in time, but he didn't really seem to have a very positive reaction to it. I think some people maybe looked at it and thought, oh, okay, sure, it's an 18-year-old who's decided they want to be a nun. Are you sure about that?
But she was, and, in her mind, she had really dreamt of going to serve in Africa. So she set off to Dublin first because she was joining the Loreto Sisters, which was based in Dublin but did work around the world. She set off to Dublin in 1928, where she, became first Sister Mary Teresa, and then she began her study of English and kind of getting acquainted with her new life. And so on December 1st, 1928, she began her journey to India from Dublin, stopping off in Paris, and then she had an important stop in Sri Lanka and in Madras, where she really saw poverty like she'd never seen before.
And this is grinding poverty. I mean, not the type of poverty where you kind of look around and you think like, wow, these structures that these people live in are incredibly poor. This is a type of poverty where these people don't even have, roofs over their head, and, people are sleeping in the streets, just getting in where you fit in.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of poverty where, you lay on the ground to sleep, and if it's flooded, you try to sleep standing up because you don't have anything.
So in 1929, she finally makes it to India, and she's formally made a Loreto novice. Now, at this time, she's staying at this hill station called the Darjeeling Hill Station.
In the Himalayas.
And it's way out there. Now, she's really known for the work that she does in Calcutta, but this place is a pretty good distance away from Calcutta. It's by car today, over 15 hours. So it's not exactly close to Calcutta, and I don't know how long it would have taken to get there, presumably by train.
I don't even know, because I'm sure there wasn't a train station waiting outside. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how you even get to the nearest train station, then you train there. It's almost certainly a several day journey.
Yeah, definitely not something that's easy to do. And she began while she was there to study Hindi and Bengali while living at the Darjeeling Hill Station. And we've already mentioned that she had to pick up English just a few years earlier.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
because I believe the official language of the Loreto Sisters was English. And so they didn't, they wanted you to learn that. And I actually believe that for the most part, she gives up her native tongue for most of her life. And not until almost the end of her life does she use her native language again.
Well, they forced them to, not forced isn't the correct word, but they told her, you should not speak your native tongue. You should only speak in English while you're here. And I think it was obviously, it's like that, the Middlebury or whatever approach where it's like, well, you're here. You need to just use the language that you're going to be using.
Yeah.
And don't confuse this stuff by using your native tongue.
And it was probably necessary because people of the Loreto Sisters came from all over the world. So it was like, you're going to have all these different languages. Like, we have to have one language to be able to communicate with each other.
Right. Now, she also, during her time there, would visit the poor in Calcutta. And eventually, by 1931, she starts teaching in Darjeeling. And she's teaching history and geography, mostly to abandoned girls. And one thing that's very interesting about this is that she had no formal qualifications to teach history or geography, which makes my pursuit of a doctorate degree in history seem,
Worthless.
yeah.
No, but it is crazy. It's also funny to think back even later on than this, but probably around the same time. If you had a bachelor's degree in something, you were an expert.
Oh yeah, the man. Now, I got a doctorate degree, and I'm like, do I really know anything about history?
Right.
Yeah. So from there, she is sent to Intali in Calcutta, which I think it's like a convent, like Intali.
I mean, who knows? Probably wrong. But I believe Intali is a neighborhood in Calcutta, and they had a convent or complex or something like that the Loreto Sisters operated out of, based in Intali, and Spink just refers to it as Loreto Intali.
Yeah, and this happens now. The biography is not exactly clear, but this takes place sometime before 1935.
Right.
What me and Eric were able to determine was it happened before 35. Can't tell you exactly when. So she basically serves in Calcutta for, at that point, from then on, like a decade.
Yeah.
Uninterrupted, just going about her time, teaching. And
nunning.
If you know anything about, history, these are complex times around the world. We're leading into the Second World War. And India was obviously, we know it's a part of the British Empire, but it wasn't necessarily directly taking part in the fighting, though there were a lot of Indians that did fight on behalf of the British Empire. Now, there's conflict very near to India.
Real quick, can you imagine being like an Indian soldier at that time? Like some random British guy walks up to you and is like, hey, I need you to go and fight halfway across the world. It's like, neat.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing that what we learned was that there was a movement for an independent Muslim state.
Yeah.
And a lot of those people that were willing to take up the British on that offer were Indian Muslims that were trying to drum up that sort of commitment from the British that once we reach independence, we'll get our own state.
Yeah, and any reading of history will tell you that the British were really good at following through on that stuff.
Well, this one they actually did follow through on, surprisingly, but that's a discussion for a little bit later. So there's fighting that's very close to India, particularly in Burma, where the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Americans, led by Vinegar Joe or whatever his name is, were fighting very close to India. And the British, all the while, are sort of siphoning off certain supplies from India. And this produces a perfect scenario where things are going to get real bad really quickly.
It's getting hot.
And India's hit with massive famines. I mean, famines on a biblical scale.
Yeah.
Where millions of people are dying from a lack of food. And this is the Calcutta that Mother Teresa is serving in 1943. And she sees some horrible things, but they work, obviously, to alleviate the suffering of the people.
We should also say real quick that, so all this is taking place that Melvin is talking about in 1943, but in 1937 is when she actually takes the title of Mother Teresa.
Ah, yes. She becomes officially Mother Teresa in 1937 when she becomes...
She takes her lifelong vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity. And because before that, her quote-unquote title was Sister Teresa.
Right. So she's fully Mother Teresa by 1943 when the war and the famine take place. Now, she's also working within an escalating conflict between Hindus and Muslims in India. Obviously, as I mentioned just a moment ago, there were movements for an independent Muslim state. And, the Hindu people in India were not necessarily happy about this. I mean, There's the loss of territory and there's the loss of the unified nation.
And it's also important to remember, too, that, the British were excellent at pitting minorities against each other in their territories. So they had because what it does is it makes it harder for a group to unify against the empire. And so the British had put, they would put a Hindu person in power over like one thing, and then they would put a Muslim in power over something else. So there was just this constant tension, but there was no unification against any of the British. And so they started to fight against each other. And so this all, is a much larger story that ends up in the splitting of India into India and Pakistan. But 1946, August 16th, 1946, is a monumental day in the history of Calcutta and India at large, but it really was focused in Calcutta. There was a Muslim congressman who was also the leader of the Muslim League, which was a party in India. His name was Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And he sees the British and the Hindu factions and stuff like that, planning to partition and this sort of thing. And in his mind, he's like, we're going to get the short end of the stick, and I can already tell. And so he's rejecting these attempts to talk and do all this. And then on August 16th, 1946, he announces Direct Action Day is what it's remembered as. And he calls for direct action. And, politically, this was supposed to be like a series of meetings and protests, but it quickly devolves into a giant riot that consumes the city and leaves utter destruction in its wake. I believe the number I saw was something like 4,000 dead and
100,000
like 100,000 homeless after this. And this is one of the most impressive. I mean, there are going to be several times that we say this, but this is one of those like impressive displays of like bravery from Mother Teresa in the midst of this utter chaos, like chaos that I can't even like imagine. Like you sit there and you actually try to think about it from like like where I live now in this peaceful Western democratic society. I can't imagine if I, walked out the door and it was just utter chaos.
Just doggy dog world.
Seriously. And like everyone, like neighbors killing each other, like people that you had seen, and they're just coming after you now. And I can't imagine that. But Mother Teresa was an incredibly committed person. And part of what she did at the convent at Antali was, they were responsible for feeding these children and everything like that. And with the outbreak, a lot of the children were stuck at the convent. And so they were eating through their supplies relatively quickly, and they ran out. And on August 16th, 1946, they were out of food. And so little Mother Teresa, and if you've ever seen her before, she's very small, decides she's like, well, we got hungry kids and we're out of food, and I'm going to go get some food. And, people tried to get her to stay because they're like, listen, it is going down out there. But
they're going to murder you.
Yeah, but I mean, like, as was her thing, like, she just always believed that, God would provide. And so she goes out on her own into the chaos and luckily gets stopped by some soldiers. And she's like, you gotta let me pass. I gotta get this rice. So they actually picked her up and got rice for her and brought her back to Antali. And it's just like, man, if that were me, I'd be like, listen, kids, we're not eating today.
The cojones on that woman.
Seriously.
I mean, I think it's almost one of those situations, too, where like sometimes you see in movies where like there's a battle scene going on, and then the people that are fighting see something so strange that they can't even like continue to fight or, like shoot at it or each other. And I could just imagine like Mother Teresa walking through these war-torn, chaotic streets, just like, is there any food over here?
Yeah, and according to Spink, she didn't get super deep into the city before the soldiers found her, but like she did see a lot of the carnage, and it really affected her, and it really opened her eyes to like the destruction, and it was her first taste of war, and obviously that is not something she became she was unfamiliar with by the end of her life, but that was kind of the first time that she'd ever seen like the destruction that man can do to itself.
Yeah, so pulling back just a little bit, before what we call Inspiration Day, which we'll get into just a moment, Mother Teresa had a sort of spiritual advisor, which I think is relatively normal for a woman in her position. It was a man named Father Van Exem.
Fred Van Fleet.
I don't think it was Fred Van Fleet.
Oh.
And he was a Belgian Jesuit who, from the biography, seemingly was reluctantly...
This man was an academe, and that was what he was here for.
Yeah, he was not really all that interested in serving as a spiritual advisor for Mother Teresa at all, at least initially.
Shout out to him real quick, though, because apparently, if I recall correctly, he would just like go and live among different populations and like become expert in their language.
Yeah, it seemed very like anthropological, where he goes and like lives with the people, studies what they're doing, and then I don't know, writes about it.
Yeah, it also seemed that because if I recall correctly, he was working a lot with Arab populations, people who spoke Arabic and like Urdu and stuff like that, and he was exchanging ideas with like their equivalents, their holy people and that sort of thing. But he was really into the academic version of this. He was really into spreading knowledge, preserving knowledge, that sort of stuff. And I mean, he was a committed, priest, but also he wasn't super interested in being anyone's spiritual advisor.
Boy, was he committed. Because when the message came down on high that it's like, no, you should work as this woman's spiritual advisor, he was like, man, all right.
Fine.
Yeah, so we just had to take a moment to point out the fact that this guy comes into her life, and she kind of chose him to be her spiritual advisor, and he plays a little bit of a role, or a lot of bit of a role, throughout the rest of Mother Teresa's days.
Yeah. But as Melvin alluded to earlier, there was an incident called, not Direct Action Day, Inspiration Day. And what happened was, more or less, she had gotten sick in Calcutta at Antali. And in order to recover, that was one thing we did not mention, is that throughout her childhood, she was kind of like sickly, and she had, what was referred to as like a weak chest, which I believe is probably just like lung and heart issues.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much everyone that seemed to have encountered her in this time thought she was going to die.
Yeah.
Like, you want to serve people, but this is probably going to kill you.
Yeah, and they said early on, especially at Darjeeling when she first got there, like they would, without making it super noticeable to her, like give her like light work to do because they were afraid that like she would be overburdened.
But she's an absolutely tiny woman. Like,
yeah, but she's also an absolute machine. As we come to see.
Right. I mean, I think they definitely we misjudged this one.
Yeah, but anyway, she's hit with another spell of sickness or whatever, and they decide it's for the better for her to go back to Darjeeling to recover. And I believe she was on a bus when it happened, that she sort of, she was very explicit about the fact that she didn't have like a vision. It was like something came over her that like really called her, that, she interpreted it as God speaking directly to her, saying that you need to go and work with the very poorest of the poor.
Man, what did she see outside that bus window?
Well, that's the thing. Like, I believe it was in an interview with Spink that, Spink asked her, like, was this a vision? Or like, what was it? And she said it wasn't a vision. It was just like, I just knew.
I'm just imagining like, the bus is rolling down the street and she's looking out the window and like, man, those are some really needy people.
Yeah.
Like, I need to do what I can for them. But I mean, obviously the way that she portrays it was something that was far more divine than that. Not quite, visions, but some sort of calling that she felt kind of pressing upon her spirit.
Yeah, and so she goes to her spiritual advisor, Father Van Exem, and, she says to him, like, this is what I want to do. Like, I want to go and I want to live not in Antali, not in these, these convents, which they weren't by any means, like, luxurious, but, like, she's like, I need to live like the very poorest of the poor.
Yeah, you weren't getting in your Bugatti and speeding away from the convent,
Right. But I mean, like, they had their basic needs met, and like,
right.
There was always the assurance that there was going to be food and there was going to be shelter and stuff. And she was like, no, I need to go and suffer right along with the poorest of the poor. And Father Van Exem was like, hold up, we need to run this by a lot of other people. And this is where we're going to pause for a second and just say, Melvin and I have no idea how the Catholic Church works.
Yeah, this is some deep stuff.
So if you're really into like I hope this isn't offensive, but lack of a better term, like bureaucracy of the Catholic Church, pick up the book. There's a lot of detail in there, and I really tried to understand it, but I couldn't. My very base understanding of it was, at this time, in order to do something like this, she needed the permission of an archbishop named Henry Perrier. And so Father Van Exem started talking to him about that on her behalf, but didn't want her to tell anyone else, because my impression was that if this were to go all the way through, she would be leaving the Loreto Sisters altogether, and they just didn't want word of that to get around.
Yeah, so she pretty much had two options in terms of pursuing this path. because remember, she had already taken vows of chastity. She'd bound herself to kind of working within the Loreto Sisters,
within the
Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And to do this, she had to sort of change those vows a little bit. So she had two pathways to doing this. There's one thing that they called an indult of exclausation, which basically meant that she was leaving to go out into the world, but she was not leaving the kind of the organized faith, which is ideally what Mother Teresa would have wanted. Now, the other pathway is called an indult of secularization, meaning if she were to accept an indult of secularization, she would just become a normal person. She would no longer be within the structure of the Catholic Church as a more than just a practitioner.
Right. My understanding of it from reading Spink was that the indult of secularization would have made her more or less like civilian, and that really this Archbishop Perrier was really pushing for that.
And I think Van Exem also kind of, initially wanted her to do the same thing. I don't think he had a horse in it so much so, but when it was told, he was like, yeah, indult of secularization.
I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure Van Exem was actually pushing her for exclausation because he was afraid that because with the indult of secularization, you were totally
no protections,
cut off. Like, if something bad happened, like, I'm not saying that they would turn her away, but like there was no guarantee that she would be helped. And well, Perrier really wanted to make sure that her faith in God and God's plan to take care of her was total. And so that's why he was pushing the indult of secularization.
So my understanding was that Van Exem, there was some concern about this because this wasn't the first time that somebody had tried to do this. There was a young woman that had tried to do the same thing previously and it ended badly. But I think what they thought was that if she were still connected to these sort of official structures as a representative of the church, the people in India, which she was going to serve, would have more respect and reverence for her, which would kind of give her a little bit of an added protection.
You're saying that if she was still connected to Loreto? Or
if she were to go out into the world and just practice, but she doesn't have the backing of anything behind her,
they would respect her more?
No, that they wouldn't have.
Okay, that was his. That was my reading too. I thought we were completely opposite.
Yeah, no. That was their concern was like if you go do this, you need to be coming in an official capacity. You can't just show up and be like, hey, I'm just a lady and I'm here to do this. Because maybe no one would take you seriously. But I think there was someone else who really kind of helped her get the indult of exclausation, which was, I don't know if you remember, but Mother Gertrude.
I don't remember the names. Again, I was like lost in trying to figure out who these letters are being written to. But I just remember what really sticks out to me was that she had to send all of the things like when she was going to request this stuff, she had to send them through Perrier, and he would always cross out.
Well, I thought she sent them to Exem, and Exem sent them to Perrier.
Right, but then he had to cross out, or he didn't have to, but he did. He always crossed out the request for the exclausation and made it secularization.
So actually, looking at my notes, it says Mother Gertrude seems to have helped to sway Father Exem's opinion. She wanted Mother Teresa to get an indult of exclausation. So Father Exem had to Van Exem had to be swayed to that position. And it seems like Mother Gertrude just was like, have faith in this, keep asking for the indult of exclausation, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and so it gets to the point when she makes her official request to the church that she actually does request the indult of secularization. Yeah. And I say luckily, we don't know what happened, but it is portrayed as luckily. She was granted, quote unquote, an indult of exclausation.
And there were some rules tied to this.
Yeah. So she had to go, she was going to go into the city and the church was going to help her find lodging, but she wasn't allowed to have her own congregation. She had to still attend mass somewhere else because there couldn't have been mass conducted anywhere that she was in charge of. And she also was answerable to Archbishop.
And the other interesting point is that this indult of exclausation was only good for 1 year and had to be renewed basically based on her performance in that first year. And one other stipulation to this was that, okay, if you're going to do this, you have to go out and get some sort of medical training because they didn't think that she could actually serve the poor without knowing something about medicine.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to the, lack of a better term, mission statement of the Loreto Sisters. They believed in assisting the poor through education. And so he was like, listen, that's all well and good when we have these convents and stuff, but like if you're going to really be working with these people, you need some medical training.
And he was absolutely right. I mean, some of these people that she would encounter and help were people that were going through some very serious medical conditions. So she couldn't just show up and say like, hey, you know, as we always say, like, hey, we're going to pray on it. But she needed to be able to do a little bit more, but she wasn't there to replace some sort of, you know, hospital or anything of that measure.
So initially, she goes out, she leaves the Loreto Sisters on August 16th, 1946 to go and get that medical training. And then she goes, I believe it's in Patna, I don't know. Sorry, I can't say it. But she receives a few weeks of medical training there and then heads out into Calcutta to live with the Little Sisters of the Poor.
And Arif, we're going to emphasize a few weeks because Father Van Exem was expecting Mother Teresa to spend like at least a year studying. And he was shocked and aghast at the fact that she left after a few weeks. And, you know, one other thing that threw him for a loop was that the people who were training her was like, yeah, she's good.
Yeah.
In terms of what she's going to be doing, she doesn't need to know any more than this.
And I don't think we've stated this very clearly yet, but once she feels this calling from Inspiration Day forward, she's like, get me there. Like there's a huge sense of urgency for her. And so she was like totally dedicated to this medical training because she knew she had to get it done before she could go. But like the whole time she was like, okay, I know how to do this. Can I go now? And that sort of thing. But anyway, she initially, while the church is looking for a more permanent lodging for her, she goes and lives with the Little Sisters of the Poor, which is also Melvin's nickname for the Toronto Raptors. So she stays there for a little while, and then eventually they find this house owned by, I believe, the Gomez brothers or something. They're just two brothers who happen to have some space in this house that not in great shape, but that was fine with Mother Teresa because part of what she wanted to do was suffer along with the poor. And so she really wanted the most sparse and difficult place to live.
This reminds me a little bit of Coming to America, where they show up and they're like, yeah, so like, where do you guys want to stay? It's like some really poor spots, you know?
Yeah.
Like, where do the broke people live? I need to go there. And one thing that's interesting about those early days of her working in Calcutta is that, you know, this is Mother Teresa and she's called to do this, but it wasn't exactly perfect. And that's what comes out in the biography, is that she did go through some very tough times. I mean, some really, really deep loneliness.
Yeah.
And that she's questioning, like, am I doing the right thing? Like, and all she has is that faith to lean back on. And sometimes she even struggled with that.
Yeah. Because, I mean, if I recall correctly, she even said, you know, that walking, the steps that she took away from the Loreto Sisters were the hardest in her life. And that's harder than leaving her family. You know what I mean? Like she had not only, I mean, by this point she had been with them for years and years. And so, you know, they had really become family to her. And so this was, you know, Mother Teresa, one of the most dedicated people I've ever heard of. But I mean, that doesn't mean she was without doubt.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, you get those hints of the human element, which is really important to her legacy, is that she never really seemed to have wanted to be something that was made special.
No.
Because it detracted from the idea that we all can and should be doing this. That,
and also she was always adamant that, you know, any glory that came from anything that she did should go, you know, right to God. And she even intentionally burnt some of her papers that she thought might be used by like later people to make her look good. And she was like, nope, don't ever want that even out. And I guess she was actually kind of reluctant to have books written about her. I mean, obviously by the time this was written, she had already been in the public eye for a long time, but for a long, you know, they talk about, and we'll get into this later, some of these interviews and stuff that she did, that she was very uncomfortable on camera. She wasn't super interested in being interviewed in the first place. And when she did, it was only because she thought that it would further her mission in helping the poor.
Yeah, so she actually, which is kind of interesting, is once she gets her own congregation, she is basically forced to record this stuff. Like Arif said, she wanted to kind of get rid of a lot of the documents, but they told her, like, fine, you know, if we're ever going to get rid of all the documents, it's up to you to write the entire history. of your order.
Yeah. But, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So real quick, before, I said that she had gotten this house or this room in this house owned by these Gomez brothers that I believe the quote was that she said it was rich in poverty or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
It was very sparse. But before that, even when she was living with the Loreto Sisters, she had established a quote unquote school for the poorest children of India of Calcutta, I should say, that, this doesn't just mean that like mom and dad are struggling. These are kids who have, in most cases, been abandoned. Like they're, very young kids. It's like, hey, you're on your own now. Like, and a lot of this is not necessarily because of like callousness on the part of the parents. A lot of it had to do with the fact that, some of these families just could not. They were like, this child is going to die, and we as a family may die trying to save her. So that's who a lot of times Mother Teresa was serving in these early days. And really the school, all it was a little space amidst these, these huts in the slums of Calcutta that she was using to teach these children anything she could. A lot of what she was trying to do was give them basic reading, writing, hygiene, needlework skills, like survival skills, more or less. And then eventually she would try to get them to like, if she had the resources, when she got the resources, to like type or something like that like might be a skill that they might be able to find work.
Yeah.
doing.
And it's really interesting that we're talking about the students that she worked with in those early days, because as we mentioned before, she was very lonely at times when she moved down to Calcutta because she was living on her own. But in 1949, she has one of her students, pretty much the first person that joins her in this calling, decides to come and live with her and work with her in Calcutta.
And just before we go further with that, I also want to point out that the huts, when she was, around this time, when she and these first few former students of hers who become the first members of her congregation are doing their work, is kind of the first time that the people of Calcutta notice what she's doing, even though it's a small way, but it's kind of like, who is this, white European lady who is always like, who's got this crowd of like slum children around her all the time. And people, they were inspired, and, they started to give her resources, and eventually she was able to purchase or rent the use of the two huts, so that at least they weren't standing in the sun all day when they were doing this. She eventually had the funds to be able to make sure that all these children at least got some like milk every day, and would give them soap and that sort of thing. So immediately, as soon as she was beginning to become recognized in Calcutta, she was putting those resources to use to help these children.
And by the late 1940s, her work is growing. And this is when she actually starts to get the idea for having an official congregation. And later, her congregation is actually officially approved by Pope Pius the Seventh.
That was in 1950, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, 1950. So she's really, she's left the convent, and now she's establishing her own congregation in Calcutta, which is going to continue to grow over the years.
And if I recall correctly, again, so don't understand all the inner workings of the church, but in having that congregation established, I believe that in their area that they have, their chapel or whatever it would have been called, they were able to now conduct mass, take communion, and they were at this point completely separate from the Loreto Sisters.
Yeah, and when they made that move, they had to find a place that was suitable to host the congregation.
And this is one of my favorite moments in the book, because one thing that you will get from this book over and over and over again is that people weren't drawn, the people who were drawn to Mother Teresa weren't just Christians. And there was just this understanding at the time, it seems like, or is at least portrayed in this book, that doing good, no matter what religion you are, is serving God, no matter what God that seems to be. And it just like, it seems so poignant to me living in 2018, where everything is so, polarized. And I really think a lot of it is a function of like social media and stuff, because if you've ever been around like truly religious people, like they don't think in the terms of like the egg on Twitter. You know what I mean? Like, I have family who are missionaries, and like, you know, they're doing good for the sake of good, and they knew Muslims who are doing good for the sake of good. And, you know what I mean? And that's really what comes out in this book, and that is a long way for me to get to how they get their new mother house, which becomes the mother house.
So they purchased this home from a doctor whose name is Dr. Islam, who he's moving. So as we mentioned
Going
before,
to Pakistan.
He's going to Pakistan because India and Pakistan, they're now two separate states. You know, we have a place for Indian Muslims, and a lot of these people took the opportunity to move. I believe there was 7 million, roughly, people that moved from Pakistan to India, and 7 million that moved from India to Pakistan.
Yeah.
And it was a turbulent time, but he saw what Mother Teresa was doing and agreed to sell her his house for a very generous, for like basically next to nothing when you look at how much the house was worth. I believe it was, in the book it stated that he sold them the house for literally less than what the land was worth.
Yeah. So he sold it for very little, and the quote that he was, you know, quoted as saying was that, I received this house from God, now I give it back to him. And that just really brings out what I was talking about before. Like, this was a man who recognized that what she was doing was in service to God, and whatever that meant, he believed that doing good like she was doing and helping her in that mission was doing it for God.
And one thing that's crazy to think about is that this took place in the immediate aftermath, in the midst of enormous religious conflict in India. So that's one thing that makes this extremely remarkable. And another thing to think about is, even if we had stopped the story right now, right, the work that Mother Teresa has done is quite significant. I mean, she's been serving the poor of India literally since 1931, really.
Yeah,
I mean,
31, or I believe it was 31 that she started teaching. So, I mean, she was a Loreto sister at 1929, at the beginning of 1929. So she's been doing this for quite a while.
Yeah, I mean, she's been doing this for over 20 years, and things really start to pick up once she's got her congregation. And
yeah, and so the congregation becomes they're known as the Sisters of Charity, and Spink goes into a lot of detail about the Constitution and like the written rules and that sort of thing that they put into place. But more or less, it was the life of a nun taken to extremes. Like, and especially the vows of poverty.
One thing that's interesting is that, you know, they talked about Mother Teresa wanted to take the vow of poverty to a level that was absolutely kind of absurd. To be honest, I mean, she wanted to have a sort of diet that was really extreme. Basically, they were going to live off a little bit of rice and a little bit of spice.
Yeah.
And people had to tell her,
you're going to die.
You cannot serve these people if you're malnourished.
Yeah.
So she had to finally agree and say, okay, we'll have some vegetables with our rice.
Yeah, there was like I just, in my head, like imagine them like negotiating over like, this is how many peas I'm going to eat. Like, no, you need to have at least 3 more, and going back and forth like that. But she was really living the idea that in order to serve the poorest of the poor, I need to live like them. And, you know, people really had to temper her desire to do that. And regardless, she, you know, really embodied that in drawing up the Constitution and that stuff for the Sisters of Charity. And they didn't have it easy, you know, and that was on purpose. They spent, you know, every day they were up at 5 a.m. working, praying, and then they would spend the majority of the day out among the poor, doing anything they could, educating, helping the sick in any way they could, you know, feeding the hungry as much as they were able to. And then they would come back. You know, they would have, again, very small meals. They would have more time of prayer, meditation. Then, you know, eventually they would go to bed. But I mean, it was pretty much wake up, pray, help people, eat a little bit in between, go to bed.
Rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
So, you know, by 1953, she's, you know, the Mother Superior of her own congregation, and they also identify another problem. So, India at this time, you know, limited resources to help people. And also, if you were going to receive help, you needed to have the money to do so. So, you have a lot of people that are sick that end up dying in the streets in Calcutta.
Yeah.
And
this was a known problem. The government recognized this. So they were they were not displeased to see Mother Teresa doing what she was doing.
Exactly. They see this woman who is offering to solve their problem for them, basically, or to attempt to solve it.
Yeah, because like journalists are picking this stuff up, and it's not looking good for the government.
And really, this is a question of visibility, because what's happening is people are dying in the streets, and like Arif said, it makes the government look very poor.
Yeah, and it really highlights the disparity between the wealthy and the poor, because a lot of times they're going to hospitals but being turned away because they don't have the money to pay for it.
Yeah, which is, I mean, for us, it's wild to think about, although it's not
not that wild.
Yeah, not that far out from, 2018. But what Mother Teresa wants to do is she wants to establish a place where people can come and die with dignity. Yeah. So basically, it's solving the problems of the city because it's getting these people that are dying off of the streets. The last thing that we want to see is people dying on the street corners. If we can find a place where they can go and, receive a little bit of treatment and a little bit of help seeing them on their way to the other side, then that's a win-win for everyone. And what they need is a place to do this. And that's when they kind of get offered this place, which I guess is the Kali temple. Yeah,
the temple of the Hindu god Kali. And it becomes, or I don't believe the whole thing initially becomes, I believe it was like the temple, in my understanding, was more or less like a compound. And so part of it had been like completely abandoned and fallen into disuse. And so they came in and said, like, listen, we're not using this section. You can use it for, to give these sick and dying a place to die with dignity. And that place becomes, again, I apologize to anyone who speaks Hindi, Nirmal Hriday. It's Hriday. I don't know how to make that noise with my mouth. But that is translated by Spink as the place of the Immaculate Heart. And that's actually where we're going to cut off for today. We will pick up there next week with what follows after that, her work at the place of the Immaculate Heart, and what goes forward.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Make sure you tune back in.
Yep, we'll see you then.
Hey, before we take off, I just want to remind you guys how you can support the show. First, you can rate, review, and tell a friend, and also follow us on social media.
Especially Twitter. We're at the Life of X podcast. Additionally, you can head over to lifeofxpodcast.com/support, where you will find portals to audible.com, amazon.com, and patreon.com. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Audible is a gigantic and wonderful audiobook website. You can receive a free audiobook when you sign up through our website. If you go through our Amazon portal, any purchases that you make, Amazon kicks us a small percentage of that. And finally, you can head over to our Patreon page where you can sign up to make a contribution to the show on a per episode basis. We appreciate your support. Thank you.